Dean Paisley is what you'd expect a 25-year veteran of the FBI to be. He's a very honest, straight shooter, and he knows Mark Whitacre very well. He was the FBI supervisor in the ADM Mark Whitacre price-fixing case, and he says this question mark should not be on this title. He says that he has no question that Mark Whitacre is a national hero. But in the early 1990s, Mark Whitacre was keeping a $9 million secret from Dean Paisley, and it was a secret he would regret.
My biggest regret would be that I didn't tell the FBI about the money issue during the time that I was working with the FBI.
But those in the FBI who were working with Mark Whitacre to build a case against ADM were shocked when their own informant was sent to prison for 9 years.
It was the first time in history that anybody had been a cooperative witness for the FBI and was prosecuted in the same case that they were assisting. It doesn't make sense.
Dean Paisley worked for the FBI for 25 years. He was the FBI supervisor during the Mark Whitacre ADM case. He is not a fan of the movie The Informant.
I know from experience going through that it wasn't a comedy. It was anything but a comedy.
Would you be willing to wear a wire? We need your help.
And the 25-year FBI veteran is also not laughing at the treatment that Mark Whitacre has received.
I always felt that he didn't get a fair shake, either from the FBI or the system. He didn't deserve all that happened to him.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to switch microphones and all these recorders. It kind of reminds me, all these different tape recorders kind of reminds me of the days that I worked for the FBI with all these wires attached to me. So it kind of brings back some memories, that's for sure. But I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I'm both honored and humbled to be here to be able to share my personal story with you and what Christ has did in my life and my family's life after everything and all the adversities that we went through. And I'd like to start off by having you imagine something. Imagine yourself when you go back to work after this meeting this morning, after this prayers breakfast. Imagine yourself that you have a tape recorder attached to your body, that you have another tape recorder in a briefcase, and that you have a third tape recorder in a notebook. And that you're going to be taping your coworkers, your supervisors, and in some cases, taping your friends. Now imagine doing that every day for 3 years. Because that's exactly what I did do from 1992 to 1995. I had a tape recorder attached to my body. I would meet the FBI at 6 every morning, where they would shave my chest, hook the microphone to my chest. They would hook the recorders to my body. They had a stretch band where it would actually be in my back. Then one in a briefcase and one in a notebook. And that would happen 6 o'clock every morning for 3 years, Monday through Friday. And then for 2 nights a week, I'd meet with the FBI from 6 o'clock to midnight to turn over the tapes and go over the evidence that I was accumulating on this fraud that was occurring, on this price-fixing scheme that was going on at ADM and other companies. To do a price-fixing scheme, it's an international cartel, and we were getting together with our competitors and basically ripping off and stealing from our own customers. So it was a very unique life during 1992 to 1995. It was 20 years ago. I was 32 years old when I joined ADM. I started working with the FBI when I was 34 years old, and I'm 55 years old now. And the company that I was wearing a wire up against was no average company. What you had for breakfast this morning, what you have for lunch today, and what you have for dinner tonight, 9 times out of 10 has something from ADM in it. ADM is one of the largest food additive companies in the world, known as Archer Daniels Midland. When you go to the grocery store and you pull off any grocery off the aisle and put in your grocery cart, and you look at that ingredient label on the side, 9 times out of 10, at least one ingredient in that food that you're putting in your grocery cart, be it Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Kraft, Kellogg's cereal, General Mills, General Foods, and so on, 9 times out of 10, at least one ingredient was produced by ADM. Again, the largest food additive company in the world, $70 billion in revenue, not 70 million, but 70 billion, and 30,000 employees, number 56 at that time on the Fortune 500, so the 56th largest company in America and the 90th largest company in the world. So they were no small company. I do want to emphasize at this point, ADM had 30,000 hardworking people that did the moral and ethical thing every day. hardworking people. And it was 4 people at the very top of the company that lost their way, and I was one of those 4, where greed became our focus and tainted that company and put a cloud over that company. So I want to make it really clear that ADM itself was a very good company. It was just 4 people that lost their way, and they were the 4 people at the very top, and like I said, one of those 4 were myself. My position at that time at ADM at age 32, in 1989, I became the divisional president of the biotech division, which was the fastest growing division of the company. And I was the youngest divisional president in the 100-year history of that company. And 2 weeks before I met the FBI, I became corporate vice president of the whole company, in addition to being divisional president of the biotech division. So one would ask the question, well, why would I become an FBI informant against my own company when my future there was so bright? Before I answer that question, I want to really mention, I mentioned that greed became our focus, and greed for sure became my focus. And there's nothing wrong with having a nice home and so on, but when greed, the kind of home you have and the kind of cars you have become your entire focus, then you're in a bad place. And that's where I became. At age 32, in 1989, so you're talking over 20 years ago, 23 years ago, my base salary then was $350,000 a year, 23 years ago. But you're in a public company, your stock options and your bonus becomes your major part of your compensation. And my compensation during that time was about $3 million a year. And being 7 years out of college and earning $3 million a year at age 32, I thought I was a rock star. And I bought this house, 13,000 square foot house, 8-car garage, had a Ferrari, 2 BMWs, 2 Mercedeses, and greed became my entire focus, and definitely was in a bad place. And definitely one of the reasons why myself and 3 other executives lost our way, and it was our downfall in this case. So the reason why I blew the whistle on the largest price-fixing case in history is because of my wife, Ginger Whitacre. And I've been with my wife almost my whole life. I started going with Ginger when she was in 7th grade, and I was in 8th grade. I'll show you a few pictures of that situation. But again, she was 13 years old and I was 14 years old when we started going together. We got married in 1979, 33 years ago, and happily married today, which is, for the incarcerated, I'll get to in a minute. It's amazing to still be married after going through incarceration. But when I came home one evening, she was raising our 3 children, 3 young children, and one of them's disabled. He's 33 years old and still living at home today. He'll live home permanently. We adopted 2 out of our 3 children, and one disabled and requires a lot of attention and so on. And it's a blessing to adopt a disabled child. I can tell you, he has changed our hearts and changed our lives. But she was raising these 3 young children and hadn't worked for about 15 years at that point. And she could tell something was changing in me, that I wasn't the person that she married years earlier, and that greed was becoming my focus. And it was all about how much income I could make. When I was making $2 million a year, I couldn't wait to make 3. And when I was making 3, I was wanting to make 5 and wanted to be the next president and so on. It was never enough. And so she could tell something was on my mind. So one evening in November 1992, I was 34 years old, she was 33 years old. She asked me what was going on. And I told her how we were getting together with our competitors and how I was involved with this crime for 7 months at this point. And we were formed a price-fixing scheme, an international cartel where we were stealing from our own customers. And she never heard the words price-fixing, my wife, at that point. So she asked me to define it further. And I said, well, basically, when we inflate the prices and charge Coca-Cola and Pepsi, and by the way, Coca-Cola and Pepsi, almost everything in there is ADM. About the only thing that Coca-Cola and Pepsi add is really the water and a can. The high fructose corn syrup, the citric acid, the caramel color, all that's produced at ADM. So the ingredients in those foods come from ADM, but when they pay a higher price for those ingredients, they pass that on to the consumer. So I described to my wife that's stealing from her mother, her grandmother, her aunt, her uncle, her brother, her sisters. Everybody goes through those grocery stores we're stealing from $1 billion a year. And she asked me the most logical question I've ever been asked in my life at that point. She said, you're a $70 billion company, legally. Why would you steal $1 billion a year when you're $70 billion a year legally? But see, with greed, it's never enough. We could have been a $100 billion company or a $200 billion company. We still would have stolen that $1 billion a year because with greed, it was never enough. So she put her foot down and she said, Mark, Either you tell the FBI or I will. And within an hour, I was sitting and confessing with the FBI for 4 hours. My own wife turned me in, and I went to prison. I'm still married to the same wife. That's unusual for someone turned in by someone like that. But we sat for 4 hours where I confessed to the FBI how we were stealing $1 billion a year from our own customers. Well, when you confess to a crime like that to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you have to then, that's how you become an FBI informant. FBI informants in most cases have broke the law. In order to get a lower sentence or immunity, they work with the FBI because of that. And that's how the next day, the reason why I had a wire hooked to my body, one in a briefcase and one in a notebook, because of confessing to the FBI of that crime. And my wife deserves a full credit for that. I really believe firmly, if she hadn't, it was proven in court that price fixing was going on for 14 years at that point. I was involved for 7 months, but for 14 years already at that point. And I feel firmly today that price fixing still would be occurring if it wasn't for my wife blowing the lid on the largest price fixing case in history. So think about it for a minute. What would have you done? Would you have taken the path that my wife took, which was do the right thing morally and ethically, and expose that case, that theft, that fraud? Or take the path that I was taking, that was continue to rise up the corporate ladder, making millions of dollars with my stock options, bonuses, and base salary, and just continue to look the other way? I rationalized and said, well, my bosses are doing it. There are 3 guys above me. It must not be that bad. And that's how I rationalized, and that's how I talked myself out of that it wasn't a fraud. But my wife looked at it black and white. It's a fraud, and you have to expose it. I told her at that time when she was forcing me to turn myself into the FBI that I'm likely to go to prison, that we're going to lose this house, the cars, our kids will no longer be in private schools, and so on. And she quickly came back with an answer and said she'd rather be homeless than be involved with a home with illegal activity. And we were almost homeless as a result of that. And she was willing to sacrifice everything to do the right thing. And she even said if I went to prison, she would stay with me. But that if I had to go to prison, I had to go to prison. But we had to do what we had to do. The background of my wife and I are very similar. We grew up in a small town called Morrow, Ohio, about an hour north of Cincinnati, Ohio. And my parents, 85 years old, still live in the same home that I was raised and grew up in. And her parents live about 10 minutes down the road. And I mentioned to you, we started going together in 7th grade and 8th grade. I grew up in Christian roots, and I was forced to go to church during that time. My parents still go to the same church at 85 years old, same church they went to back then. But it took me going to prison at age 41 to learn the difference between going to church and really being a believer and really being a Christian and having a personal relationship with Christ, because I was just going through the motions. It took me going to prison to know that. I thought by going to church, well, I must be a Christian. I go to church every Sunday for 30 years. Boy, it's a lot more than that to be a believer. I also do not have the typical resume of a white-collar criminal. I graduated from, as Mike mentioned in the introduction, I graduated from Ohio State University. I was one of a dozen students that got picked during their first year to go into an honors combined program and get their bachelor's and master's simultaneously in 4 years instead of the normal 6. I was a gifted student, had a full scholarship, the same kind of scholarship that an athlete gets, but I got for academics. And I graduated at age 21 with both my bachelor's and master's simultaneously given to me at graduation in that honors gifted program. I had multiple scholarship offers for a PhD, several of those from Ivy League schools, and I got my PhD at Cornell University in biochemistry at the age 25, which was one of the youngest PhDs to ever to graduate in biochemistry at the age 25. The average age was about 30 for a PhD in biochemistry. And prior to me being diagnosed decades later for obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, and bipolar disorder, I wasn't diagnosed 2 years later, but I'm going to show you a direct result of OCD and bipolar disorder prior to diagnosis and treatment. I continued my education after I finished Cornell at age 25. Even when I started employment in the Fortune 500 company called Ralston Purina, I continued my education nights and weekends. And here's a direct result of OCD and bipolar. I ended up getting a law degree. I ended up getting an LLM, a Master's of Law, specialized in philosophy of law. This is all part-time as I'm working in Fortune 500 companies. I ended up getting a doctorate, a PhD in psychology, a PhD in economics, and an MBA in business. I ended up getting 9 degrees, 6 of them doctorate. So that's a result of undiagnosed OCD. took treatment to stop that education from happening. Now I want to switch gears just for a minute and talk about what it was like to work undercover for the FBI. Working undercover for the FBI, first off, let me ask you, how many have you ever worked undercover for the FBI? How many's working undercover for the FBI right now? I see two hands roll up there. They just blew their cover. But I would leave, as I mentioned, 6 in the morning, meet with the FBI. They would shave my chest. They would hook these microphones to my chest. And this is 6 in the morning every day for 3 years. This became a part of life. And they'd hook those microphones to my chest after they shaved it. They'd hook the tape recorder to my back with the stretch band. And then it wasn't quite as obvious as these right here, hooked to my belt. And then at 6 o'clock, I mentioned till midnight, I would go over all these tapes and debriefings and polygraphs and so on that you had to do when you worked undercover. And that went on for 3 years. So I would build the company during the day and act like a very loyal executive, a very loyal employee. But at night, I would be tearing down the very company that I built during the day. So it was definitely a life at odds with itself. And these meetings were not just in Decatur, Illinois, where ADM's headquarters are located, which is 3 hours south of Chicago in central Illinois. These meetings were all around the world. They were in Zurich and Hong Kong and Paris and Mexico City, and they were monthly, and they were all around the world. We had 7 corporate jets. We could fly anywhere around the world we wanted to. I flew one time to Hong Kong for lunch. That's an example of the greed and the focus and the wrong focus that we had during that time. And following around the world with us was this green lamp. This green lamp looks like it was purchased from a yard sale, but the FBI and prosecutors wanted to be able to show a jury videotape, not just all the audio that I had connected to my body in the briefcase. So this green lamp was the video feed for that. And this green lamp followed us around the world for 3 years. And it's a good thing that the 11 co-conspirators that were stealing $1 billion each, $1 billion each company, $1 billion, were all men. Because I'm convinced if there was a woman among us, she would have noticed that this green lamp that looked like it was purchased from a yard sale was following us around the world, and that this green lamp did not match the 5-star decor of a Mandarin in Hong Kong, a Shangri-La in Singapore, or Four Seasons in Chicago. But when you got 11 guys stealing $1 billion each, greed blinds you. And they never saw that green lamp for 3 years. During a price fixing meeting in Hawaii, someone set their chair, the back of their chair, right in front of the lamp. So the FBI's in the next room trying to see what's going on. It was a very important meeting. They wanted to be able to show prosecutors and be able to show to a jury, because this was a very long 2-month trial. So it's a tape they really wanted on video. And I went up to that individual that blocked that lamp with his chair, because backed right up to the lamp, and I told him that they're going to need that table behind him where the lamp was for refreshments, that the hotel was going to need that. And I moved him 2 feet aside. That way the FBI had a wide view. Everything's going on. And that's how you had to think on your feet when you're working undercover for the FBI. During a price-fixing meeting in Irvine, California, and the interesting thing is I did the prayers breakfast at the Orange County Government Leaders Prayers Breakfast just last Friday, May 11th. And it was in this Irvine Marriott Hotel near the John Wayne Airport, on the very hotel where this meeting happened in 1993, 19 years earlier. In my briefcase, which the FBI didn't have the equipment 20 years ago like they have today, and it was that old reel-to-reel type of tape recorder, and it started clicking during that meeting. So here we have a green lamp in the corner that's already been following us around for 2 years, and then my tape recorder starts clicking. I opened the briefcase and started fiddling the recorder to get that noise to stop as that meeting was going on, and people were sitting to me no further than 2 feet, about like the distance you are there at the table. And no one noticed. Again, no one noticed the green lamp. No one noticed me fiddling my tape recorder. No one noticed the clicking sound. The greed blinds you, and they didn't see what was going on around them. This is the actual tape recorder that was used in Japan, and that's in the FBI Museum now in Washington, D.C., that tape recorder. And that tape recorder was that small micro cassette recorder, because they didn't want me to take all the other equipment across customs through Japan. So this was the recorder that I would use in 3 different meetings where I taped over there. But the duration of each tape, of this tape recorder, is 45 minutes, but the meeting's 3 hours long. So I had to constantly look at my watch, and every 45 minutes run to the restroom in Tokyo to flip that tape over to the other side, to come in to have fresh tape on that tape recorder where I could tape the entire duration of that 3 hours. And that, again, no one noticed. Like I said, greed can blind you. After wearing that wire for 2 years, my wife pulled me off the driveway during a rainstorm with a shirt and tie on. It was a horrific thunderstorm. She pulled me off the driveway at 3 in the morning, and this is when I'm getting closer to being diagnosed for bipolar. But she pulled me off the driveway, and she said, you need to come back to the house, and more importantly, you need God in your life. And I told her, and at this point in time, I would have been about 36 years old. I was wearing a wire for 2 years. And I told her, I said, well, who needs God in my life? I'm going to be the president of the 56th largest company in America. Who needs God? And that's how far gone she knew I was. And she told the FBI, she contacted the FBI the next morning. She said, look, I need to hospitalize my husband. He's having a nervous breakdown. He'd blown the driveway off with a gas leaf blower, blowing leaves off the driveway at 3 in the morning during rainstorms. And the FBI said, look, ADM is very connected. If Mark sees a doctor, a psychologist, or psychiatrist, he will have to tell them what he's under pressure doing because he's working for the FBI, and that could expose the case. So we cannot let you see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, that Mark cannot see one. And not only was I able to see one, I went undercover for another year after that. And it's one of the reasons why they're so supportive today and how they've come full circle with their support. But one of the things my wife told me when I told her during that rainstorm, when I told her I was going to be the president of the 56th largest America, even after wearing a wire, she said, Mark, I am telling you, you're going to lose this job. You need to come to reality. You need to stop being delusional. You can't bring this company down and think you're going to be the next president. These guys are going to prison, and you're going to put a cloud over this company like it's never had before, and you need to come down to reality. You are not going to be working for ADM when they learn that you were the FBI informant. So that sunk in for the first time. And I started thinking, well, I'm going to lose this $3 million a year total compensation. It's going to take me years to get back on my feet. It was very difficult at that time in the 90s to get a new job after being a whistleblower. It probably would have been easier to get a job as a felon than a whistleblower at that point of time. It'd be easier today. So I started thinking, well, how am I going to take care of my family financially? So I wrote I calculated how long it would take to get back on my feet. I thought about 3 years. I multiplied what I was earning by 3 years, which was $9 million. I wrote $9 million to myself of checks from ADM. I formed companies and used a bogus invoice and wrote these $9 million to myself. And I thought to myself, if ADM came to me and said, Mark, you stole $9 million from us, we're going to prosecute you, I already had my answer. And my answer was this: you guys are stealing $1 billion a year. You've done it over a decade already in this price-fixing scheme. You forced me to be part of that illegal activity. How can you go after me for $9 million when you're stealing $1 billion a year? You turn me in, I'll turn you in. So I felt protected. And I was protected until they learned that I was the informant and I was the mole and that I already told on them on the price-fixing scheme. Well, then they were going to expose me too. And within an hour, they told the FBI and the media that I stole $9 million from them. So I was exposed once they learned that I was the informant in the case. And even with that, what's amazing is even with the FBI knowing I stole $9 million the very time that I worked with them, and most of that being the last few months when I knew I was going to lose that job, they went with my lawyer, who's now a judge in Chicago, and they went to meet with the prosecutors and said, look, Mark Whitacre is the highest level executive ever to turn whistleblower in U.S. history. Would never have this again. Mark Whitacre wore a wire for 3 years when our own agents don't wear one longer than a year because they crack under pressure. He wore one every day for 3 years. Mark Whitacre stole $9 million at a time that his mental stability was at its worst and at a time when he's blown the driveway off at 3 in the morning during rainstorms. And we did not, and the FBI said we did not allow him to see a psychologist or psychiatrist when we probably should have. The prosecutors listened to that and they agreed to a 6-month prison sentence, a 6-month plea deal. All I had to do was sign it. My lawyers brought me in the next day to tell me about that deal. All I had to do was sign this plea deal for 6 months. But here it is again, Mark Whitacre, not relying on God for guidance, not having a personal relationship with Christ. Mark Whitacre, a train wreck, relying on himself, continued for his own guidance. I fired that lawyer. I distanced myself from the government. I could have had a 6-month prison sentence before I had full immunity already until I stole the $9 million. And even with the $9 million, I had a 6-month plea deal. And I fired my attorney, distanced myself from the government, and 2 years later, after fighting the case, got a 10.5-year prison sentence. 10.5 years. And in the federal system, there's no parole. You have to do 85% of the sentence. I did 8 years and 8 months of federal prison on a 10.5-year prison sentence when all I had to do was sign that deal and have 6 months. These guys, these prosecutors and FBI agents were doing everything they could to help me. But I was becoming my own worst enemy and cutting their legs off along the way. And I quickly went from corporate jets, fly anywhere around the world, to handcuffs into a county jail. You've seen it with Enron, WorldCom, Tyco. You've seen it over and over, and that's exactly what happened in our case. The other guys did go to prison for price fixing, but I went to prison for fraud, for the $9 million in fraud. And that's what the movie was about greed and about power and about losing our way and about mental illness. And that's my identical twin on that picture with Ginger and I, Matt Damon. I think you can see why they chose him, since we look so much alike. But that's what the movie was about. And it ended with going to prison for 9 years and the other individuals going to prison for price fixing. But what we're going to talk about here, the rest of this testimony, is what's happened since. Is there redemption? Are there second chances? And that's what I want to talk about. And that's what was published in the book by Stephen Hoover about Mark Whitacre Against All Odds, which is the book based on faith and what faith did for our family and how I was able to transform my life with federal prison, even in federal prison. And by the way, 9 years in federal prison is a long time. It's like closing these doors and locking them, and we're not allowed to leave this room. And it's not near as nice a room as this in prison, and not allowed to leave this room to 2021. That's what 9 years of prison is. I was in prison from age 41 to age 49. I got out 5.5 years ago in 2006. To put it from a family perspective, our youngest son was 6 years old and in first grade when I started undercover. He was in 7th grade and 12 years old when I went to federal prison. He was 21 years old and a junior in college when I got out of federal prison. From 6 years old to 21 in junior college. It was the whole life of our kids. The collateral damage I caused for my family. Even though I've been out of prison for 5.5 years, it never leaves you. There's not a day go by that I don't think about the damage and collateral damage that I did to my family. Shortly before I entered prison, 4 months before I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and OCD, I attempted suicide twice. I couldn't, after I threw the 6-month deal out the window, I couldn't fathom going to prison for a decade. I just couldn't put my hands around it. So I attempted suicide twice, and someone in the newspaper read that, a person named Ian Howes in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He was part of a group called CBMC, Christian Businessmen Connection. And he started visiting me at my house for 3 days a week for 4 months before I went to prison, going through Bible study, Operation Timothy, and just being a friend at a time when I'm losing all my friends. When I had 7 corporate jets, I had all the friends in the world. But when I'm going to federal prison for a decade, they become very far and few friends. And so he started visiting me every day, or 3 days a week during that time, and he planted a seed. And being a scientist, being a PhD biochemist, I still couldn't put my around God. He was planting a seed, but I needed more. So I started looking what other scientists that believe in God, what evidence they looked at. And I was overwhelmed. Even Albert Einstein was even a believer in God, and showed in his essays and his memoirs how the Big Bang Theory didn't work and the universe was created by God. So from a scientist's perspective, that started convincing me. So after I entered prison, after those 4 months and after that seed was planted, Chuck Colson, the White House counsel for President Nixon that went to prison on Watergate, as soon as I entered prison, my case was high profile like his, and he reached out to me. As soon as I entered prison in 1998, 14 years ago at age 41, and he became my mentor when I was in prison. He just passed away about a month ago and was a great friend and done a great thing and a lot of great things in prison ministry. But he was a great mentor that helped that seed that the CBMC planted to help that go further. And 3 months after I entered prison and after Chuck Colson became my mentor, I got down on my knees in a cell in Atlanta, Georgia. Finally, I had all the time in the world to read and study and reflect, and no more impulse reactions. There's no impulse reactions to make in prison. They choose when to turn the lights on, when to turn them off, what you eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There's no decisions you make whatsoever. So I had plenty of time to read. I was reading the Bible 4 or 5 hours a day, plenty of time to reflect. I had a chance in prison for 9 years to read the Bible from Genesis to Revelation every year for 9 years. All the way through, every year. And it was remarkable. It was one of the greatest things that ever happened. And 9 years of prison was a net gain and not a net loss. I gained from that. It didn't lose anything. But 3 months into prison, my prison sentence, and when I talked about the burdens that I had, And the first burden was that led to my suicide attempt, would I even have a family when I got out? If you serve 5 years and longer in prison, be it state prison or federal prison, it doesn't matter which one, 99% divorce rate. So the chance of myself having my high school sweetheart still married to me when I got out of prison was a 1% chance. 99% divorce rate. The second burden was, how would my family survive financially? We lost everything at that point. My wife was a stay-at-home mom. We had one son disabled. How was she going to handle this financially? The third burden was, would the FBI ever forgive me for not telling them about the $9 million and then not taking the 6-month deal that they helped create? Would they ever forgive me after they became my friends for those 3 years? And then a fourth burden that weighed heavily on my heart that led to 2 suicide attempts before I entered prison was, would I be employable? Even with an Ivy League PhD, would I be employable after 9 years of prison and a convicted felon when I got out at age 49? And these burdens became so great, and I couldn't sleep at night. And 3 months into prison, I got on my knees, and for the first time in my life, I surrendered to God. Even though I've been to church my whole life, every Sunday, I got on my knees and surrendered to God and said, God, I have made a train wreck of my life. I've got to confess to all these crimes that I've done, and I need forgiveness. And more than anything, these burdens about having a family, would I be employable, they're too great for my shoulders. I need bigger than man's shoulders. And I put those on God's shoulders in my 3rd month in prison in 1998. And for the first time in my life, I felt peace and contentment. I can remember right when I got on my knees, I was in Psalms 139:7, and I never forget that, in June 1998, where Psalms 139:7 talks about where God would always be present and would always be with me. And then I remember getting to Psalms 139:12 that talks about there would be light. And here I'm in this dark prison cell in Atlanta, Georgia, 9 years of prison yet to go, 9 Christmases ahead of me, sitting in federal prison with my family, if I had a family, because statistics was against me. And that's when I surrendered to God and said, God, I need some help here. I've made a train wreck of my life. And for the first time in my life, I felt peace and contentment that everything is going to be okay. And for those 9 years of prison, not only was everything okay, miracles started to happen when I took away my own guidance and started having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ and relying on Him for guidance. And I'd like to talk about some of those miracles. First off, not only did our family survive the 99% divorce rate and survive the 1% stay together, we not only survived, we thrived. As a family, we got better, not bitter. And the only difference between those two words is the letter I. I being selfishness and bitterness that could get when people go to prison, and a lot of them do get bitter. Or the other E for better, which has eternal value. And as a family, we did get better, tremendously better, and we thrived it. God pardoned me in that June of 1998 when I confessed to my sins and I repented and I said, I need to change, God. I need it more than anything for my family. My family deserves better. My wife has stayed with me and been with me my whole life, and she deserves better, and our children deserve better. And God forgave me, and He pardoned me. And a pardon from God is a lot more important than a presidential pardon, tremendously so. And after God pardoned me, about the miracles and about the 4 things that led to those suicide attempts, the 4 burdens that I had. My family, not only did we survive that 99% divorce rate, I was in 3 different prisons during 9 years. My wife moved to live next to each prison, and the visiting hours in federal prison are Friday nights and all day Saturday and all day Sunday. You get 20 hours to visit your family. My wife came every Friday night, every Saturday, every Sunday, every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every holiday for 9 years. She never missed. She moved to 3 different states to be with me. If that don't tell you what kind of rock she is. And our children too. And that's why faith kept us together. And that was against all odds, because like I said, divorce is the most common outcome in that. The second, how would my family burden that led to those 2 suicide attempts before I had God in my life and before I was treated for bipolar disorder and OCD? I worried about how would my family survive financially? How would they make it? I was a breadwinner. We lost all our stock, our house, our cars. We lost everything, which what happens when you break the law and you steal millions of dollars, you're going to lose what you made legally too. The food companies we stole from, 11 of them got together, Tyson Foods, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Kraft, 11 of them got together, contacted my wife, We didn't even know any of them personally. This is where God touched their hearts. And contacted my wife and said, look, we know your husband's a decade in prison. We won hundreds of millions of dollars based on your husband wearing that wire for 3 years on class action suits where they sued ADM for stealing from them on price fixing and sued the other companies also that were part of that cartel. They put my wife back to college to become a teacher. My wife hadn't finished college at that point. At age 40, she went back to college to become a teacher. She was Teacher of the Year of our city in 2008. Teacher of the Year. They put my kids through college. They put our kids through college. Those companies did. The very people I was stealing from. If this is not a symbolism of what American companies are about and what God can do in our life, touching through their hearts, touching their hearts. Those companies we were stealing from paid our house payments, our car payments, our kids' college, my wife's college for 9 years. They adopted my family and took care of our family financially. God made that happen. He took that burden off my shoulders because I was making $20 a month instead of millions of dollars during those 9 years in prison. And I deserved everything I got. I really did. I didn't deserve 6 months. I deserved 9 years. The FBI and prosecutors, as you saw in that video, the 4 FBI agents and the prosecutor become my biggest supporters. Tremendously so. They're trying to give me a full presidential pardon today. The pardon doesn't matter to me. God already pardoned me, but I do respect and I do appreciate tremendously that they support me and forgive me. And they started visiting me in prison and became my biggest supporters. I've done 4 events for the FBI, including 3 weeks ago event. And last year I was their keynote speaker at the FBI Quantico Academy for the FBI agents. Another example of God's miracle of what God did in our lives. My career, remember I had a burden, would I ever be employable coming out at age 49? Convicted felon, even with 9 degrees, I'm coming out a convicted felon, 9 years of prison. I had 4 offers when I got out. I joined a biotechnology company. The day after I got out in cancer research, the company I still work for today, 5.5 years later, it's a great company, a great culture. It's run by a Christian CEO, and it's been a tremendous opportunity and to be involved with cancer research and such community-minded work and be allowed to do these kind of things at the very company I work for has been tremendous. And so God took care of that burden. He touched the hearts of CEOs and allowed me to have a second chance at my career in biotech and employment. So all 4 of these are miracles that God did in my life. Once I turned over the reins to Him instead of trying to guide that train myself. So I'm an example of redemption. And I'm an example of the second chances in America. A prime example. And there's a lot of cases like that. I know hundreds of cases. And for example, like Christina's story also. And God does redeem. He does redeem us. And He does give you a clean slate and give you a chance to start over no matter when it was. My start over wasn't until age 41. And He still gave me a chance and a clean slate to start all over again. And it took me going to prison at age 41 at $20 a month for 9 years. $20 a month. No more $3 million a year. No more 13,000 square foot house. I had a 10 by 10 prison cell for 9 years. And for the first time in my life, I learned what my education was for. It wasn't used all that education for myself. I helped hundreds of guys get their GEDs, get their 2-year degrees. They had some of them dropped out of school in 8th grade, 9th grade. I helped them finish school. And it was so rewarding to use my education in something so productive and so purposeful as compared to just using that for selfish reasons. And those individuals that I helped get their high school diplomas still write me today. It is great to see them out of prison and community-minded, very productive citizens. And I felt like I had an influence on them. And like I said, 9 years of prison was a net gain, not a net loss. Because finally I had life with purpose instead of just life about myself, selfishness, and greed. I've had a chance to continue in prison ministry. I've talked to 5 prisons already this year, and I feel like it's one of the main things that God has given me and one of the main missions and main purpose in my life in prison ministry to help give inmates hope and help let them know that they will have a second chance and they can get their life back and have a better life than they had before when they went to prison. And I really enjoy going back into prisons. In Romans 8:28, to me, summarizes my story. And it talks about, as we go through adversities in our life, He can still take, God could still take all those things. He can take those ashes in your life and turn it into beauty. And that's what 8:28 is all about, that when you believe in God and His purpose, He can turn all things into good. And that's what He's done in my life with those miracles that I've described. So I urge you, if you haven't already, I urge you tremendously to reach out to Him and to reach out to God and have a personal relationship in Christ. And because He can do amazing things in and through your life, just like He did in my life, my family's life, and what He's done for us. Even with the adversities we went through, He turned those adversities and those ashes into beauty. And I thank God for it every day. I think we serve an awesome God, and my life has changed because of two men, a CBMC individual and Chuck Colson, who planted those seeds and got me to the point where I would start having a personal relationship with Christ in my life. And I'm forever thankful for what God has done in my life. And I thank you very much, and God bless all of you. Thank you.